Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. On the evening of June 12th, 2023, 27-year-old Anastasia Rubinska vanished from the island of Kos, Greece. It was a Monday. The sun was still visible over the Aegean Sea, casting long orange shadows across the stone alleys behind the resort town. The streets were quiet. Tourist season had just crested, and locals were locking up their shops while seasonal workers, like Anastasia, prepared for another night shift. That night, she never clocked out. Her last known contact came at 8:31 p.m. local time, a message to her boyfriend. 5 words: "Someone will give me a ride." She'd intended to walk back to their temporary housing, or perhaps hitch a ride from a coworker, but she never returned. No camera caught her walking into the complex. No coworker heard from her. Her electric bike was found locked and untouched outside the hotel by 9 p.m. Her boyfriend reported her missing by 11 p.m. When he told local officers she had sent a text about a ride from someone she didn't name, they downplayed it. A grown woman choosing not to come home isn't a crime, not immediately. But he insisted. This was out of character. She was careful, skeptical, and something felt wrong. The official missing person file wasn't opened until the next day. That delay would later become a point of contention. The police report time-stamped 10:06 a.m. the following morning marked the first time her name entered the formal system. Kos police began what they categorized as a low-threat disappearance. At that point, the procedural checklist was straightforward. Contact employers, speak to roommates, ping the phone. It's in this initial contact with digital forensic specialists that the first inconsistency appeared. Anastasia's smartphone had stopped transmitting at precisely 9:17 p.m. GPS placed her final known location near a remote patch of undeveloped land northwest of Antimachia, away from the resort clusters. It was nowhere near her typical walking route. The terrain there wasn't residential. No businesses, no paths, just brushland and fenced-off olive groves. That set off a quiet internal flag. At that time, she had been expected to be in bed. She had an early shift the next morning, and the route her phone data followed was incompatible with any logical path back home. Her boyfriend, still visibly shaken, was interviewed formally at 1:20 p.m. He surrendered both his phone and laptop voluntarily. Investigators ruled him out within hours. His own device location showed he remained at the residence, and his web traffic was consistent with him staying inside. He had also attempted to call her 6 times between 9:30 and midnight. None were answered. The messages, too, went unread. A team was sent to scan the area of last GPS contact by 5 p.m. that Tuesday. The field team reported no signs of disturbance, but admitted visibility was poor and vegetation dense. A thermal drone pass scheduled for the following morning was expected to be more useful. At this stage, the missing persons unit made the case available to national authorities. The Polish embassy was notified. Anastasia's parents were informed through consular channels. From a public standpoint, there wasn't panic. Not yet. But within the internal logs of the forensic task force assigned, a comment was added by a senior investigator at 6:43 p.m. GPS dropout location suggests voluntary ride accepted, but coordinates terminate in a non-residential zone. Behavior inconsistent. Possible coercion. Log proximity housing. In practical terms, that meant they were now treating the disappearance as suspicious and had begun building a digital proximity map of individuals who lived, worked, or passed through the area where the signal stopped. That's how the name Salahuddin entered the file. By Wednesday morning, a cross-reference between cellular tower pings and metadata from nearby mobile devices narrowed the search. One signal stood out: a prepaid mobile phone registered under a temporary SIM, often used by short-term workers, had traveled an identical path to Anastasia's phone that night. The SIM was not registered under a real name, but the device IMEI had a location history traceable to a workers' shelter near Cartagena. The building was a single-room structure owned by an informal employer, used to house undocumented workers. It was just a 10-minute walk from the GPS termination point. No arrests were made, not yet, but the building was placed under quiet surveillance. Inside the building, police noted a man matching the time-stamped path had scratches on both forearms. He claimed they were from clearing brush. He showed no visible sign of panic. He offered his device for review, a cheap Android model with no password, but recently factory reset. He gave his name as Salahuddin, born in Bangladesh. Arrived in Greece in late 2022. No criminal record, no local references. But by noon that Wednesday, forensic techs had managed to retrieve fragments of the deleted search history from his phone. Two terms were time-stamped between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. on the night Anastasia disappeared. How to hide a body? Can police track dead phone? Those entries changed the trajectory of the case. The status was officially upgraded to a potential homicide missing persons, critical risk classification. By the morning of June 14, 2023, the procedural focus of the investigation had narrowed from a presumed disappearance to what was officially logged as a high-risk missing persons case with criminal indicators. The decision came not from emotion or conjecture, but from a sequence of technical and environmental inconsistencies that simply didn't align. The device believed to have mirrored Anastasia Rubinska's final movements was tracked using tower triangulation and location metadata extracted from secondary mobile devices near the drop site. That data was critical. It established a tight digital perimeter. One device's movement aligned within 95% of the path Anastasia's own phone followed in the last 42 minutes of recorded location data. The signal vanished in the same dead zone. That wasn't random. The phone belonged to a temporary worker housed on the island. Not formally documented, not tied to an employment contract. The phone itself had been factory reset, another anomaly flagged by investigators as statistically rare for devices under active daily use. It suggested either concealment or panic. In the forensic notes, a supervising investigator wrote, "We don't assume guilt based on a reset phone, but you don't clear your browser history if you're making dinner." Satellite imaging was ordered over the olive grove, where both phones stopped transmitting. Thermal drone imagery showed a series of flattened vegetation patches inconsistent with animal activity. Investigators flagged the site for physical grid search. Cost to most visitors is whitewashed villas, cheap ouzo, and rental scooters weaving between beaches and night markets. But the island's economy also leans heavily on short-term migrant labor. These workers often live outside the regulatory grid. They clean, harvest, and patch buildings behind the scenes. And few employers ask too many questions. In these blind spots, oversight is minimal, and predation is easier to mask. The shelter in question, where the phone signal had originated, was inspected on June 15th under a limited warrant. Law enforcement obtained entry based on grounds of exigency, suspected link to a high-risk disappearance. Officers documented the space as unsanitary, unmonitored, and used by transient laborers without permanent identification. Inside the structure, a single mattress was stained and folded. No sheets, 2 towels on a hook, a half-empty pack of Greek cigarettes, 1 broken SIM card. Forensic techs found strands of long, light-colored hair stuck to the bed frame. This, at the time, was not disclosed to the press. DNA samples were lifted and fast-tracked to Athens for analysis. The comparison was underway against samples retrieved from Anastasia's hairbrush and personal effects, delivered by her boyfriend. Meanwhile, location logs were used to cross-reference nearby commercial surveillance systems. One camera, mounted outside a closed bakery, captured footage that, when enhanced, showed a woman matching Anastasia's build and clothing, walking with a man toward the outskirts of the field zone. Time 8:52 p.m. Her shift had ended 15 minutes earlier. There was no return footage of her on that path. The initial suspect, connected by proximity and by digital signal pattern, did not resist questioning. He acknowledged seeing Anastasia once at a local supermarket but denied further contact. He claimed to have spent the evening in the field behind the property, clearing brush, and had no idea where she had gone. Forensic review of his clothing revealed fragments of plant matter not found in the field he claimed to be working in, but did match flora from the exact coordinates of the last pinged phone location. Soil samples from his boots further supported the misalignment. Still, nothing at this stage met the threshold for arrest. Legally, authorities required hard forensic correlation. The match would come from Athens, pending DNA verification. Behind closed doors, the investigative team was already building a timeline. The chief investigator logged a note on June 16th. "The movements are too precise, too clean. Sometimes that's the problem. As part of protocol, the team examined the suspect's digital footprint beyond the factory reset phone. An older device had previously synced with a cloud account, no longer in use but still accessible. From that backup, investigators recovered partial browser history from June 10th to June 12th. Among the final entries, how to move body without smell, can deleted GPS be recovered, olive field death bacteria. That history added weight to the working theory that this wasn't a random act. It was calculated, even rehearsed. These searches didn't prove action, but they negated the claim of ignorance. A second field scan with cadaver dogs was initiated on June 17th. It was there, within 300 feet of the mattress shelter, that a handler noted a prolonged signal under a patch of dead brush. The foliage had been deliberately packed. Beneath it, a plastic trash bag partially buried under loose dirt. Inside was the body of a young woman. Preliminary visual ID matched clothing worn by Anastasia on the night of her disappearance. Medical examiners reported early signs of manual asphyxiation and post-mortem concealment. Time of death was estimated between 10 p.m. and 12 a.m. on June 12th. The cause was recorded as homicide by external compression of the airway. A full forensic sweep of the site was ordered. The area was isolated and media presence restricted. Meanwhile, the embassy facilitated immediate notification of next of kin. Back at the central lab, DNA from the mattress shelter confirmed a match to the victim. The long strands recovered were identified as hers. Soil from the site matched the particles embedded in the suspect's boots. At this point, the threshold had been met. But before any arrest could be made, the team reviewed all available data. One final check, reconstructed GPS mapping, revealed that both devices, his and hers, had paused for 12 minutes near a public roadside pullout. It was an unusual stop. It didn't fit the route to her home. It didn't serve any logical function. A team lead annotated it: unscheduled pause, potential origin, backtrack for trace. When Anastasia Rubinska's phone stopped transmitting at 9:17 p.m. on June 12, 2023, there were no alarms raised. The hotel noted her absence on the next day's shift log, but assumed she'd taken a rest day or overslept. The island of Kos, like many seasonal destinations, operates on the margin of assumptions. Transient workers come and go, and silence is rarely treated as an emergency. But 36 hours later, silence had turned into a lead. By mid-morning on June 14th, her case file had moved from local oversight to the regional criminal unit. The catalyst wasn't just the gap in communication. It was the geographic anomaly revealed by phone data analysts. Anastasia's device had not followed a logical route home from work. Instead, it had diverted to a known no-residency zone with poor foot access and terminated in a spot approximately 400 meters from the nearest public road. This was not a detour for convenience. There were no visible footpaths, no public lighting, no benches. The terrain was dry, uneven, overgrown. For a woman walking alone at night, the location was functionally invisible, unless she was led there. Geolocation metadata retrieved from the Android device flagged in Chapter 2 continued to build relevance. Analysis showed the two phones had maintained overlapping pings across 3 towers for a full 22 minutes before their signals separated and then cut off. The path resembled a split in motion. Her phone stationary, his moving back eastward toward the shelter location. That data removed the option of coincidence. The chain of custody for the victim's device remained intact. Investigators recovered it in a locked drawer within the shelter occupied by the man previously interviewed. The drawer was unsecured, but the contents had been wrapped in a white undershirt and partially shielded under a rusted fan motor. No SIM card remained in the phone. The battery had been removed. The phone was intact but deliberately disabled, consistent with an attempt to prevent detection. This finding added forensic weight to what had previously been circumstantial. It confirmed contact. More importantly, it revealed intent, not only to mislead, but to delay. In cases of disappearance, time gaps matter, and here those first 36 hours had been wasted. Digital evidence led to environmental re-examination. Forensic officers returned to the brush zone with refined instructions: document fiber transfer, inspect disturbed soil beyond the body recovery site, and collect latent footwear impressions if available. What they found altered the understanding of the crime scene. 12 meters west of the recovery zone, Beneath a fractured rock was a single latex glove, compressed, lightly soiled, and partially deteriorated from UV exposure. It was a right-hand glove, size medium, with trace DNA matching the victim on the outer surface. The inside swabbed clean, likely due to sweat. Nearby, a partial footprint in dry soil aligned with a standard-issue work boot. Men's size 42. The working theory now expanded. The scene was not impulsive. Tools had been used, disposal planned, concealment managed. And then came the behavioral angle. Law enforcement returned to the initial interview logs of the suspect, reanalyzing his phrasing. The man had stated, "She left before dark. I didn't even speak to her." However, the timestamp of Anastasia's last message and the sunset that night, recorded at 8:43 p.m., showed she had still been en route at dusk. His claim didn't hold. Surveillance footage from a corner mini-market, secured only after day 3 of the investigation, showed two individuals, one resembling the suspect, purchasing bottled water in a plastic bag. The time was 7:58 p.m. The bag matched the brand and color of the plastic used in the body's concealment. Forensic chemistry analysis confirmed the bag fragments from the site, and the store's inventory shared identical polymer compositions and dye patterns. That result was logged into the case file with a simple note: material match confirmed. Sequence supports pre-event procurement. At this stage in the investigation, a pattern was forming. But pattern was not enough. Prosecutors would need sequence, cause, and correlation to build a homicide case beyond a reasonable doubt. To refine their timeline, investigators sought cell tower logs between 8 to 9:30 p.m. from all commercial providers in the coast region. This data wasn't used merely to locate devices. It established when they communicated and with what volume of activity. Anastasia's phone showed no activity between 8:33 p.m., the time of her final message, and 9:17 p.m., the termination of the GPS signal. This suggested the device was powered on but unused, consistent with being in her possession but inactive. Conversely, the suspect's phone showed increased background data usage between 8:45 and 9:15 p.m., including a Wi-Fi signal connection attempt that pinged a router located at the edge of a now-demolished storage building, adjacent to the brush zone. This digital trace, logged at 9:03 p.m., confirmed physical proximity to the disposal site. Investigators mapped the signal strength vectors. The phone hadn't just passed near the area. It had paused there. By the end of June 17, a formal arrest warrant was issued under the jurisdiction of the Greek criminal court system, supported by international consultation with Polish authorities. The charge: aggravated homicide with evidence of concealment and premeditated restraint. The arrest was conducted without incident. But even as the individual was detained, investigators continued refining the forensic timeline, not simply to convict, but to understand motive, opportunity, and escalation. The autopsy began on June 18, 2023, at 8:30 a.m. in the Forensic Pathology Unit of the Athens Medical Examiner's Office. The transport had been expedited overnight under court order, accompanied by 2 law enforcement officers and an embassy liaison. The remains, recovered in partial decomposition, arrived sealed with trace materials still embedded in the bag used for concealment. The forensic team had 2 clear objectives: confirm cause of death and establish an accurate time frame. The medical examiner's report would later serve as a foundational document in the prosecution's case. The findings removed ambiguity. This was not a misadventure. It was homicide, deliberate and avoidable. The body showed evidence of prolonged positional compression. Petechial hemorrhaging was present in both eyes. Mucosal tissues in the mouth and throat were damaged in a pattern consistent with external airway obstruction. The examiner concluded that the most probable cause of death was manual asphyxiation, sustained over several minutes. There were no signs of ligature marks, ruling out mechanical strangulation. The postmortem interval, PMI, was estimated at 72 to 96 hours, placing the time of death between 10 p.m. and midnight on June 12th, aligning with the digital data previously logged. The forensic timestamp was now medically supported. Superficial abrasions were located on the dorsal side of both hands, and minor bruising was documented along the right clavicle and lower sternum. These injuries did not cause death, but were consistent with defensive resistance. There was no evidence of deep contusions or fractures, No sharp force trauma, no gunshot or internal bleeding. Toxicology returned negative. No alcohol, no narcotics, no chemical agents. The victim had not been drugged. A swab from under the victim's fingernails returned trace male DNA. It matched the profile extracted earlier from the suspect's personal items. The finding corroborated close contact interaction, physical, recent, and likely during a struggle. Clothing recovered from the body included a cotton blouse, black slacks, and a single earring. The missing earring was located days later near the edge of the brush site, 18 feet from the concealment point. Investigators marked this as the possible location of the initial attack. Soil samples from the back of her pants matched mineral content from the same area. The bag used to cover the body, non-commercial plastic, gray, bore multiple creases and punctures. Internal analysis showed insect activity had been delayed, indicating the body was likely sealed before final placement. Forensic entomology supported the established PMI. Back in COS, investigators updated the case file with the full report. The timeline now had anatomical verification, environmental consistency, and forensic DNA to link both victim and suspect to the same physical confrontation window. The pathology report also introduced a new variable, the absence of restraint marks. That detail created a behavioral question for law enforcement. If the attack was planned, why wasn't the victim restrained? If not planned, how did the concealment materials appear pre-acquired? One theory emerged from the timeline. Opportunity created escalation. The initial contact may have been voluntary, walking, conversation, even perceived safety. But something shifted, fast. No evidence pointed to long-term planning, but the disposal actions post-mortem showed clear intent to obscure the truth. These contrasts raise questions about motive, ones that would be addressed in court. But at this stage, for the forensic team, their job was to reconstruct a death, not interpret it. In the margins of the final autopsy summary, a note was added by the chief pathologist. No internal anomalies. Death by asphyxiation, preventable, intentional. Scene suggests concealment occurred within 1 hour of TOD. That 1 hour window became critical. Investigators cross-referenced it with digital footprint gaps, confirming the suspect's phone dropped off the grid for approximately 56 minutes. The match was tight enough to remove doubt. When lives are reduced to timestamps, the burden of justice depends on what those numbers prove. In this case, they showed that a young woman was alive one moment, and then she wasn't, and someone made a deliberate effort to ensure no one found her. What followed would no longer be about search and recovery. It would be about accountability. The first interview after the arrest was conducted at 11:05 a.m. on June 18, 2023. The suspect had been read his rights under Greek criminal procedure. No legal counsel was present at the initial stage. He declined representation, saying he had nothing to hide. From the outset, the narrative he provided was fragmented. He admitted seeing Anastasia once or twice, claimed they'd spoken briefly, but denied any close interaction on the day she disappeared. His version positioned him at his shelter the entire evening. He claimed to have eaten alone, then slept early. When asked about the scratches on his forearms, he said they were from working near thorn bushes behind the field. Investigators already knew that wasn't true. The scratches were superficial but fresh. The medical examiner had documented similarly patterned abrasions on the victim's hands. Soil found on both their clothing came from the same location, and digital data placed their phones in proximity long after he claimed he'd returned to his shelter. The contradictions weren't just present, they were avoidable lies. That mattered. Over the course of 2 more interviews conducted within 48 hours, the suspect's account changed. He now stated that Anastasia had visited briefly and that she had left on her own after a short conversation. But when pressed on why her phone had been found in his possession, he had no answer. He paused, then said he found it outside near his doorstep. Again, the explanation didn't hold. Forensic analysts had already extracted fingerprints from the battery compartment. They were his. The phone wasn't found outside. It had been intentionally hidden beneath household scrap, with the SIM removed and battery dislodged. It had been wiped, but incompletely. Someone had tried to erase it, not discard it. Each inconsistency deepened the impression of deception, not confusion. In criminal investigations, Behavioral inconsistencies don't replace evidence, but they contextualize it. And in this case, those inconsistencies weren't minor gaps. They were methodical shifts. The suspect initially claimed he'd never touched the victim. Days later, when confronted with DNA findings, he revised that, saying she had tripped while walking and that he helped her up. This claim was not only unprovable, it was chronologically impossible. The forensic sequence showed defensive wounds and compression marks. No stumble could explain those findings. Still, even in the absence of a confession, investigators continued to document. Not every truth needs to be spoken when the data aligns this tightly. Psychological evaluation was authorized but not mandatory. A court-assigned clinician observed that the suspect displayed limited emotional response, with flat affect and persistent avoidance. When asked if he felt responsible for her death, he answered, "No, she came there herself." That final statement was logged verbatim in the investigative file. It wasn't evidence, but it confirmed a mindset of detachment. In the context of criminal profiling, avoidance paired with narrative shifts often reflects internal rationalization. That was the working theory. But again, it would be forensic integrity, not psychological analysis, that would drive this case forward. Outside the case file, the human cost remained. Anastasia's family had arrived in Greece by then. They were not present during questioning. They waited for updates that came through translators and legal officials. What they wanted, no report could provide. The why. But in homicide investigations, that's often the one piece that never fits into the official record. Still, patterns matter. When someone lies without being prompted, hides objects not demanded, and revises their story to match each new discovery, motive becomes less a mystery and more a matter of time. By June 21st, 2023, the physical evidence had already established a chain of proximity, concealment, and deception. But one element remained under review: microscopic trace inconsistencies that hadn't aligned cleanly in the first pathology round. A re-examination was requested, not because the initial autopsy lacked clarity, but because the forensic timeline now demanded precision down to the minute. Not just when Anastasia Rubinska died, but how the environment around her recorded that death. In high-stakes homicide cases, secondary forensic review isn't procedural padding. It exists to eliminate statistical noise, to verify that no variable, soil, fiber, heat decay, or cellular residue, skews what's ultimately presented in court. A single mismatched particle can unravel a chain of logic. And in this case, what emerged wasn't contradiction. It was confirmation. The forensic lab in Athens reprocessed skin samples taken from under the victim's nails. This time, they performed mitochondrial DNA sequencing, not just STR comparison. The mitochondrial data confirmed a maternal line match to the suspect's family profile, verifying the source beyond reasonable challenge. This ruled out incidental transfer. Additionally, adhesive lift samples from the back of her blouse were reanalyzed using gas chromatography mass spectrometry. The particles revealed microfragments of vinyl-based adhesive, matching the same type used in waterproof construction tarps. That tarp had not been recovered, but witnesses in the nearby shelter complex later recalled seeing one used as ground cover behind the suspect's unit in early June, just days before the disappearance. It had since vanished. This detail mattered not for what it proved, but for how it fit. The concealment site had no trace of grass or leaf matter under the victim's body, only dry soil. It suggested a surface barrier had been placed before the body was lowered. The adhesive residue on her clothing confirmed it. The disposal had been planned with materials removed after the fact. Pathology also revealed one unprocessed item from the first examination: a small abrasion at the back of the scalp. Initially dismissed as post-mortem artifact, this wound was now reclassified. Under cross-light microscopy, signs of impact bruising were confirmed. The blood-pooling pattern suggested blunt force delivered shortly before death, not the cause but a contributing trauma. The injury reframed the interaction between the victim and the suspect. The theory shifted from immediate asphyxiation to possible incapacitation, followed by restraint via compression. This adjustment recontextualized the struggle, offering insight into the timeline that had previously seemed too clean. There was now a visible progression: physical confrontation, head injury, manual asphyxiation, concealment. For prosecution, that meant intent could now be paired with a clear sequence of escalation. No longer just an act of panic, it looked like staged concealment following planned incapacitation. Meanwhile, a trace chemical report came in from the internal plastic of the bag used in burial. Volatile residue of isopropyl alcohol was identified, likely used in a failed attempt to clean DNA from the inside surface. The wipe had been ineffective. DNA remained in the fold seams. That residue, not visible to the naked eye, proved an active attempt to destroy forensic trace, intent to obstruct. Investigators noted this attempt was both clumsy and telling. The alcohol hadn't dried properly due to the tight wrap of the bag, and in doing so, it preserved what it was meant to erase. In forensic work, it's a frequent irony. The more a suspect tries to cover a crime, the more data is created in the process. With each refined result, the investigation solidified, not just because the science was accurate, but because the science told a story that words never could. The medical examiner's final update closed with this line: cause of death remains consistent, asphyxiation by manual compression. Sequence now includes blunt force to occipital ridge. Death occurred in two phases: trauma, then suppression. That line didn't change the charges, but it changed how the case would be argued in court. And more importantly, it gave the victim's family the one detail they hadn't been able to understand. She didn't simply vanish. She didn't silently fade. Her body bore evidence that she fought, resisted, and was overpowered. That fight mattered, and the forensic record preserved it, even when no one else could. The formal trial proceedings in the case of the Hellenic Republic versus defendant began on December 2, 2024, inside the First Instance Criminal Court of Kos. Security was heightened, not because of threat, but because of scrutiny. This wasn't just a local prosecution, it had international eyes. A young woman, a Polish citizen, had been murdered on Greek soil during peak tourist season. The legal weight of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. What the public didn't see was how deliberately the prosecution structured its opening strategy. The case didn't hinge on a confession. It didn't need one. It hinged on three layers of forensic evidence: physical trace, digital signature, and temporal alignment. Every presentation in court would build off these three axes. Any emotional appeal came second to data. The prosecution opened with geolocation reconstruction. A technical expert walked the court through the synced movements of two devices, the victims and the defendants. They had mirrored one another from 8:36 p.m. to 9:17 p.m. on the night of June 12th. The expert used triangulation and digital logs, not interpretation. The purpose was not to theorize, but to demonstrate simultaneity in space and time. Next came physical evidence. The victim's phone, recovered from the defendant's quarters, partially disassembled and intentionally hidden. A digital forensic specialist showed metadata logs proving manual resets and deleted app caches occurring hours after her recorded time of death. The defense objected to chain of custody clarity. The objection was noted and then neutralized by the time-stamped report logs of the officers who recovered the phone. A clear signature, unbroken transfer, and logged evidence storage all countered the claim. On day 3 of trial, the court heard from the medical examiner. The testimony was methodical. Photographic evidence accompanied the step-by-step explanation. Subcutaneous bruising, petechiae, defensive wounds. A reclassified abrasion on the back of the victim's scalp, first thought to be post-mortem artifact, was now supported by blunt trauma analysis. The ME's conclusion was clear. Death was caused by sustained manual asphyxiation following non-lethal head trauma. Time of death between 10 and 12 p.m. on June 12th. The room remained silent. Surveillance footage followed, not of the crime, but of context. On June 10th, 2 days prior to the killing, the defendant had been filmed purchasing cleaning solution, gloves, and plastic sheeting at a small hardware stand. The timestamp, coupled with the material residue found on the body bag, created a timeline of pre-crime preparation. It wasn't just the act that mattered. It was the procurement. The defense attempted to suggest that these were routine work supplies, but the prosecution presented witness statements showing no work had been assigned that week in which those materials were relevant. And the tarp once observed outside the defendant's lodging had vanished. Intent doesn't need a note. It can be demonstrated in sequence, behavior, and omission. And that's what the court was now observing. One of the most impactful presentations came through forensic audio reconstruction, not of the crime itself, but of deleted cache fragments recovered from the victim's device. One message remained, a voice memo sent to her boyfriend at 8:32 p.m., just minutes before her phone stopped moving. She sounded cautious yet casual. "I think someone's giving me a ride. I'll text you when I'm close." There was no follow-up message. The defense objected to the relevance of emotion. The judge overruled. The memo wasn't presented for emotional weight. It was used to establish expectation of safe arrival, and its absence was damning. The defense offered no alternative suspect, no plausible alibi, and no physical evidence to support the claim of accidental contact. The defendant did not testify. He remained silent throughout the proceedings, staring ahead with a fixed expression. In criminal law, silence isn't guilt, but when paired with unchallenged forensic evidence, it rarely works in favor of the accused. After 7 days of testimony, analysis, and cross-examination, the closing arguments were made. The prosecution recapped the core sequence: contact, incapacitation, asphyxiation, concealment. Not one piece stood alone, but together they formed a structure the defense could not dismantle. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. On December 9, 2024, the verdict was announced: guilty on all counts: murder, concealment of a corpse, and obstruction of evidence. Sentencing was delivered the following morning: life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. There were no outbursts, no spectacle, just a conviction grounded in forensic certainty and procedural logic. Justice isn't clean. It doesn't restore what's been lost. But in this case, the verdict returns something to the process: clarity, where for days there had only been silence and doubt. The system had spoken, not for vengeance, but for accountability. The courtroom was cleared, the cameras packed away. The sentence had been handed down: life imprisonment without parole. But for the people who mattered most in the aftermath of Anastasia Rubinska's death, the silence following the verdict wasn't closure. It was the beginning of something heavier. Her body had been flown back to Poland within 72 hours of the trial's conclusion. The formalities were swift. There were no public memorials, no press conference from the family. What little they said was through a quiet foundation that emerged 6 weeks later. Fundacja Anka, named after the nickname only those closest to her used. Its mission wasn't political. It didn't campaign for harsher laws or vengeance. Instead, it offered legal guidance and travel safety aid for women working abroad seasonally, particularly in Southern Europe. That choice said more than any statement could. They weren't seeking attention. They were trying to keep someone else from ending the way she had. Meanwhile, in Greece, the effects rippled differently. The case had exposed the absence of oversight in how seasonal workers were documented, monitored, and housed. A joint audit conducted by regional prosecutors and labor inspectors found at least 11 unofficial living sites for undocumented male workers. None regulated, none properly reported to municipal authorities. There were no background checks, no structured contracts, and no meaningful paper trail. In response, the Ministry of Migration Affairs issued new guidelines that tightened employer responsibility for labor accommodations. Those changes were slow, but they were real. The system had learned, too late for her, but perhaps not too late for others. There was also the quiet reckoning inside the forensic community. Anastasia's case became a benchmark example in cross-border training modules by the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes, ENFSI. Her name appeared not in headlines but in case notes. Analysts cited her case when illustrating the layered interaction between digital evidence, microtrace materials, and body recovery in warm climates. Her autopsy, initial, supplemental, and reanalyzed, became a tool for teaching how blunt trauma can be misread as artifact if not reviewed with precision. In a field where the victim has no voice, science becomes the statement, and her body had spoken through fibers, soil, DNA, and compression marks. Every forensic sequence translated into clarity, detail, truth. In costs, the location where she was found remains unchanged. No plaque, no marker. The olive trees still line the edge of the field. Tourists still pass by on scooters and never notice the shallow depression beyond the brush line. But some of the locals do, and a few seasonal businesses have since installed security cameras where there once were none. Safety in these spaces won't come from sentiment. It'll come from infrastructure, from policy, from remembering what went wrong and refusing to excuse it. Back in court records, the suspect never appealed. He submitted no request for sentence reduction, no motions for retrial. According to official prison records, he spends most of his time in isolation, flagged as high risk for retaliation inside the facility. He's refused all interview requests, both media and academic. His silence, unlike hers, is not tragic. It's convenient. His name won't be repeated here, not out of deference, but because this story doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the woman who took a ride she never expected would be her last. It belongs to the investigation that refused to accept coincidence. And it belongs to the forensic analysts, crime scene techs, and legal professionals who knew that truth wasn't measured in confessions. It was measured in trace particles, digital echoes, and what the body leaves behind when all else is gone. Anastasia Rubinska was not reckless. She was not naive. She was a 27-year-old seasonal worker with a shift schedule, a long-term partner, and plans to return home by the fall. Her murder didn't happen because she failed to be cautious. It happened because someone else chose to violate the boundaries of decency and because a system failed to make that choice harder. That's not a sensational narrative. That's a structural one. And when true crime is done responsibly, when the facts are prioritized, when the people are not reduced to drama, it becomes something more than story. It becomes caution. It becomes archive. It becomes instruction. When a life is taken, the silence that follows can be deafening. But stories like Anastasia's remind us, silence is also a choice. As someone who's followed this case closely, I can say this. What happened to her could happen anywhere, to anyone. It wasn't about carelessness. It was about power and what happens when it goes unchecked. So I ask you, what systems around you are quietly failing people like her? What warning signs do we ignore because we assume that won't happen here? If this video spoke to you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel something, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Or if you didn't like it, tell me why. I'm here to listen too. And if you want to hear more real stories that matter, raw, human, and necessary, don't forget to subscribe. Your voice, your views, and your awareness make a difference.